Hello, everyone. Today, I would like to talk about probably one of the most fundamental things that we can talk about when we are discussing the origin of the designation of the people of Israel, the designation of the land of Israel by the God of Israel, bringing them together. When we explore anything in the Bible, first of all, we have to realize that this is the beginning of it. This is the role of the nation of Israel is fundamental to the entire Bible. Certainly, anytime we're going to be exploring modern Israel today, what is the justification for the Jewish people to return to the land of Israel, we have to begin at the very beginning. So what I'd like to do today is lay that foundation and hope that you will enjoy and feel inspired by what we're going to be studying today, because the foundation is completely in the Bible. So let's begin with Genesis 12. Now, the first 11 chapters of the Bible, from chapters 1 through 11 in Genesis, are essentially an international story, very universal. It is the story of creation, the beginning of the world, the creation of humanity, how the various early peoples and generations lived, a little bit about their stories, the stories of God's relationship with the world. There is nothing specific in those first 11 chapters that have anything to do with the story as it will develop from chapter 12, which is the story of the selection of Israel as the chosen people. With that background, let's begin then with chapter 12, where God calls to Abraham and says to him, "Go forth from your land, from your birthplace, from the house of your father, to the land that I will show you." We know very little. We know actually nothing about Abraham until this point. There's a little bit of information about Abraham in the last verses of chapter 11, where basically all we know about him is who his father is, who his brothers are, and who his wife is. Now we have Abraham being called out from that family, in fact, from all of humanity, and given a unique mission. Actually, initially, just a unique commandment. God says to him, "Leave it all behind. I have chosen you, and I want you to do my bidding and to set the stage for something completely different." And God continues with the promises, "I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will raise up your name, and you will be for a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and through you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So here we not only have the initial instruction of God to Abraham to leave his birthplace and his family and to go to the land that I will show you, and of course that land becomes very significant, but we also have a promise that God gives him that in so doing and so departing from his family and following God's commandment, God will be setting him aside as a source of blessing, not only for him, but for all the families of the earth. Abraham obeys, and I like to say that Abraham is the first Zionist because he's the first man who heard the call of God to go to Israel. And of course, that really is what Zionism is all about. And I would venture to say that even the most secular and the most atheist Jew who has heard that call to go back to Israel, he may not recognize it as God's call, but I believe you and I will both agree that what has called him back to the land is God. Okay, anyway, Abram comes to the land. This is verse 6. Abram passes through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh, and the Canaanites are then in the land. The Lord appeared to Abraham, saying, "I will give this land to your children." And he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Okay, so he comes into the land. This first location he comes to is Shechem. This is in the heart of what we call Samaria today. And he's actually not in Shechem. He's in one of the mountains above Shechem called the Oak of Moreh. And as he's standing there on that mountaintop, God speaks to him and promises something. And now, for the first time, we will understand the purpose of this entire journey. Because God will now say, "Okay, you've arrived in this land. I am now telling you this is the land that I wanted you to come to. It is called the land of Canaan for now. And I will give this land to you and your children." Abraham immediately is very thankful, and he blesses God, built an altar in this way to recognize and thank God. So this is where the story actually begins. Now, as we move onward through the following chapters in Genesis, through the life of Abraham, and following that with the lives of his son Isaac and his grandson Jacob, we see this promise, the promise of the land, being repeated. But this initial promise is actually not just a promise of the land, it's also a promise of children. Because until this point in time, Abraham has no children. He's already 75 years old. So when God's saying to him, I'll give this land to your children, implicit in this promise is also a promise that he will have children, and those children will become a nation who will indeed inherit this land. And as we move through the story, we do see, of course, that that is something that is fulfilled in a miraculous way. Abraham is 100 years old, and he has his son Isaac, the son who will indeed inherit him. God makes it very clear to Abraham, even as he has another son, Ishmael, who has been born of the Egyptian maid Hagar. But God makes it very clear to Abraham, it is not Ishmael who will inherit him, but it is his son Isaac, the son who his wife Sarah bore to him. Now, one of the things I want to point out, that there are many times, as I said, when God repeats and embellishes on this promise of the children and the land, but I'd like to particularly draw your attention to one in Genesis 17, verse 8. Okay, this is taking place at a time where we have, again, this is part of a covenant ceremony between God and Abraham. And in the context of this covenant, in this case, we're going to be talking about the circumcision covenant. But in that context, God again repeats this promise. But I would like to focus on the language of this particular scripture, Genesis 17, verse 8. And I will give to you and to your children after you the land of your dwelling, the entire land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession. That is something that is very, very important to remember. That promise, not just that, yes, this land will be yours and it'll be your children's. How many children, how many generations? Just saying I will give this land to your children doesn't mean this will go on forever. It could mean that at some point God will decide to give this land to somebody else. In the same way that initially the land belonged to the Canaanites, at some point God decides to drive out the Canaanites and bring in the Israelites. But with these words, as an everlasting possession, it becomes very clear that God's intention is not for something temporary, but for something permanent. Okay, and we have to remember that as we move on in our story. Okay, now what I'd like to do is skip about 400 years, and we're going to move on to the nation of Israel, the new nation of Israel, who has just been redeemed from Egypt. And they have wandered in the desert already for 40 years. And of course, it wasn't supposed to be 40 years. Initially, they were just supposed to be in the desert for about a year, and then they were going to go straight into the land of Israel. But they sinned with the sin of the spies, and they are there in the land for quite some, in the desert for quite some time. The book of Deuteronomy, the entire book, takes place in the final weeks of Moses' life. Right after Moses dies, in fact, 30 days after Moses dies, the nation will then begin the entrance into the land of Israel under Joshua. So the entire book of Deuteronomy is a series of speeches that Moses gives to the nation in the final weeks of his life, where he reviews their history, where he emphasizes to them some of the most important of God's commandments, the fact that God has taken the nation as in covenant with him, and all that implies. And he's also reminding them of certain very basic things, warning them, for example, not to worship pagan gods. This is extremely important. Moses is well aware that as they enter into the land of Canaan, they're going to a place that is full of pagan worship and immorality of the worst kind. And so this is part of the warning and teaching that Moses is giving them. But I'd like to focus right now on a particular instruction, Deuteronomy 11. If we talked earlier about covenant between God and Abraham, we have God promising Abraham, but we also have a number of covenants between God and Abraham, the covenant of the pieces and the covenant of the circumcision. Here we are talking about a covenant that will take place between God and the nation of Israel. It's different from the covenant with just our forefathers, particularly with Abraham. So we have here in Deuteronomy 11, verse 26, a commandment as to a particular covenant ceremony that the nation will enter into with God once they enter the land. Behold, I place before you today a blessing and a curse. Now, blessing and curse is a way of saying covenant. Covenant really, if you think about it, is a two-sided agreement. Each side has its own rights and obligations that they have obligated themselves to. It's very similar to a contract. In fact, it is a sort of a contract. So when we say blessings and curses, what Scripture here is referring to is the fact that those who obey the terms of the contract will be blessed. Those who breach the terms of the contract will be cursed. Usually, in modern day, we talk about the consideration or the payment of a contract would be the blessing, and in breach of a contract, there would be damages that would be owing to the side who was wronged. So here we're talking about blessings and curses. The blessings, now what is the blessing? What it is contingent on. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command to you today, and the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, and you stray from the path which I command you today, and follow strange gods which you have not known. And it'll come to pass, when the Lord your God brings you to the land that you are going there to inherit, you shall place the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. So we have now a very specific instruction of how, or more specifically where, this ceremony is going to take place. It will take place after they enter the land, and it will take place in a very specific place, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And then Scripture tells us where exactly those mountains are. They are on the other side of the Jordan in the direction of the setting sun. Now keep in mind that at this moment in time, the nation of Israel is in the plains of Moab, which is modern-day Jordan, just east of the Jordan River, and therefore this is west of the Jordan River. In the land of the Canaanite who dwells in the Arava, opposite the Gilgal, next to the oaks of Moreh. Now, we've encountered this place before, Oaks of Moreh. I'll just remind you, we just talked about it a few minutes ago. Oak of Moreh is where Abraham first heard God's promise in the land of Israel. It was while he came to Oak of Moreh, the first place where he stopped, and when he entered the land of Israel, it is at that point that God said to him, I will give this land to your children. So God now is commanding the nation to come back to that very same place, to a double or twin mountains, shall we say, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, which are located adjacent to a third mountain, the Oak of Moreh. And in fact, I love taking tour groups and visitors and friends to a spot called the Three Seas Outlook, because up on that hilltop, which is just across the way from these three mountains, from the Oak of Moreh, Mount Ebal, and Mount Gerizim, you have this amazing panoramic view from where you can appreciate, on the one hand, you can see the plains of Moab, today modern-day Jordan, where the nation of Israel was camped. You can see where they crossed the Jordan and how they would have approached this area and where they would have entered into this covenant. So this, of course, is very important geographical notation, and this is actually something, I'm teaching you this from my library, but I really welcome the opportunity to teach this to you when we're standing out there, because it was, for me, even though I had read these verses countless times in many different contexts for years and years and years, I never really appreciated the connection between these two incidences, both, by the way, the only two places in the Bible where the Oak of Moreh is mentioned. So listen to this understanding that I came to. And again, it was an understanding that was, it just came to me as I was standing there at the Three Seas Outlook, looking across and understanding the geographical, and as a result of the geographical context, the spiritual context of this entire story. God first promised the land to Abraham, promised land not to him personally, but as the father of a nation, the nation of Israel. And that promise was made at the Oak of Moreh. Later on, God makes it very clear that it's going to take some time until this promise is actually fulfilled, because the nation of Israel was going to be enslaved in a strange land, and only afterwards, after a number of generations, what we see as being 400 years, do they come back out of Egypt and are now about to enter the land of Israel and fulfill that promise that God said. A long time has passed. The current people that are listening to Moses' instructions and will indeed enter into this covenant once they enter the land, they are generations after Abraham. Do they remember? Were they told this promise? Was the promise passed down in the generations? Did the promise get cut off during that enslavement in Egypt, or did it continue to be passed down? Well, there's no way of knowing. But clearly, this is a promise. I'm actually fairly confident that this promise was not something that the nation of Israel held onto as they were in Egypt. I don't know if they really knew or believed that one day God would redeem them, because there was such a long period of darkness with no revelation from God. How were they to know that this promise would actually come true? So here they're standing, executing this covenant with God, where they are looking across and they say, oh, wait, the covenant we are now entering into with God, or more specifically, the very fact of our presence here in the land and our beginning to possess this land is a fulfillment of that original promise that God made to Abraham just over there on that other hill. An amazing awareness then would have come over the people of Israel. This is not a random event. God did not just look down on Egypt and see the suffering nation of Israel and say, I feel sorry for them. I'm going to rescue them from slavery. That, of course, would have been miracle enough and reason to be appreciative. And there have been people all over the world that have been suffering and have at some way or another found salvation or assistance from God through a miracle or through more natural means, where they are able to be saved from the oppression they are feeling. But here something else is happening. This is the fulfillment of a promise. There is a plan that God set in motion all the way back in Abraham's time. And it took a long time. But God never lost sense or vision of what his plan was. And he ensured that the plan indeed would be fulfilled. So this is a realization that the nation can appreciate here, specifically because they are the generation of the fulfillment of this promise. And as they stand across from the old Oak of Moreh, the message there is so clear. I did not take you out by chance. I am hereby fulfilling the words I spoke to Abraham 400 years ago. By the way, if we talk about God fulfilling a plan that he set in motion with Abraham, there is scriptural evidence, which I will now share with you, that this plan was not something that God came up with in Abraham's time, but actually goes far long before that. Deuteronomy 32 is the song of Moses. It's Moses' final. He takes one of his messages, and it's actually in beautiful poetry. And one of the things he's doing is reviewing Jewish history and giving messages of both of warning and encouragement to the nation. And one of the things he says is in verse 8, Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, when the Most High set aside territories for the nations, when he separated the sons of man, he established the boundaries of peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. Okay, now let's take this sentence apart. When did God separate the sons of Adam? Now we know about the Tower of Babel. Until that time, all of humanity was one nation, spoke one language. And of course, in their desire to compete with God, to build a tower, to reach God and perhaps create an alternative to God, God was very annoyed and separated them up by mixing up their languages. So once all these different people could not speak to one another, they were no longer able to continue their joint project to compete with God. So what happens at that point? At that point, we have nations created. So it is at this point in time, God is saying, when he separated the sons of man into different nations, and at that very same time, he set the boundaries. In other words, he created these nations and at the same time divided the world to establish boundaries for the geographical location of each of those nations. He did so at that time according to the numbers of the nation of Israel. What does this mean? God first set aside the land of Israel for the nation of Israel. And only after he had set aside that territory for Israel was he then able to draw the boundaries of all the other countries. So we hear from here that it wasn't just something that God said to Abraham, but it happened generations earlier during the Tower of Babel. Okay, anyway, let's move on. So we see here that God has given a powerful message to the nation as they're about to enter into this covenant, that what they are experiencing now as they're going in to possess the land is indeed a fulfillment of a promise that God had made to Abraham hundreds of years earlier. What that says to the nation of Israel is that God keeps his promise, and that it's not something that you necessarily will see immediately. Sometimes you have to have quite a great deal of patience. In fact, we have a saying that the salvation of the Lord is as the blink of an eye. And what does that mean? Of course, blink of an eye is seconds. So you could say, if it doesn't happen right away, I guess it's not going to happen. That's not what it means. It means even though salvation can take, from our perspective, hundreds, if not thousands of years, for God, it's a blink of the eye. And so that's just to give you a sense of the differences between divine and human perspective on time and the kind of patience we need to have, because, of course, God's time works very differently than our time. All right, what I'd like to do now then is jump ahead to Deuteronomy 13. Before we get to Deuteronomy 13, let's take a look first at the actual text of the covenant. In Deuteronomy 11, we learn about the covenant, but we don't have the text of the covenant. The text of the covenant is given to us later on in Deuteronomy 27 and 28. At 28 in particular, the most of 28, beginning with verse 15, of course, we have a very long list of punishments that will come the way of the nation should they breach the covenant with God. And of course, God knows they will breach the covenant, but it's very depressing. Don't read it unless you want to get depressed. What I just want to do is read briefly from the very end of this punishments part of the covenant. Okay, the ultimate punishment we have enemies, war, famine, and ultimately enslavement, ultimately exile. And this is how that is written here. The Lord your God will spread you out to all the nations, from one end of the earth to the other. And there you will worship strange gods which you have not known, you and your fathers, wood and stone. And within those nations you will not find rest. There will be no relaxation or calmness to the foot of your to the bottom of your foot. It's kind of hard for me. I'm translating this as I read it. I'm reading it in Hebrew and translating it. But what we say here is your foot will not find a place of rest. There will always be, you'll never feel at home. You'll never feel welcomed where you are. But remember that phrase, your foot will not find rest. Okay? And it goes on to describe the terrible situation that the nation of Israel will be in exile. That's the end of the text of the covenant, and it ends on a very, very depressing note, with the ultimate punishment being exile. Now, remember, we talked initially about God's promise to Abraham, that he promised the land to him and his children as an everlasting possession. Here we have a covenant which, like any contract, If someone breaches the covenant, it's finished. This would seem what we're talking about here. If the blessings that come with this covenant mean prosperity and successful residence in the land of Israel, the curses here are exactly the opposite. Terrible disruptions to their existence in the land of Israel, leading to ultimate exile. This makes sense if you're talking about an ordinary contract. If I contract with you to buy a house, and you tell me I have to pay a certain amount of money, and I pay it, and I get the house, fine. But what happens if I don't pay it, or I renege on some of my payments? Then you have the right to take the house back, and I'm out of the house. In this kind of situation, God had said, your payment for the house, your payment for the land of Israel, is obeying the commandments. You renege on your payments, I'm going to throw you out. Makes sense. However, how do we reconcile that with God's original promise to Abraham of an everlasting possession? And remember, we said that one of the underlying premises of the covenant here that is taking place between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal is that it is a fulfillment of the promises to Abraham which were made initially at the Oak of Moreh. So there's a huge contradiction here. And how do we resolve that? Well, Scripture itself resolves this in Deuteronomy 30. There's an addendum to this contract. The contract indeed ends in a very depressing note, but then we have an addendum. Deuteronomy 30, and it'll come to pass when all these things, the blessing and the curse, which I've placed before you, come to be. So we're starting the situation, the premise here of Deuteronomy 30 is that it's referring to a time after both the blessing and the curse will have taken place. In other words, they're already in exile. They've been cursed. The blessing, they had a good time in the land, then they sinned, they're thrown out of the land, the curse is upon them. Then what happens? Verse 2. And the Lord your God will restore you. Okay, and you will listen to his voice and all that I command you today, etc., etc. The Lord, verse 3, the Lord will take you back, will restore you. He will take mercy upon you. He will gather you from all the nations to which the Lord your God had spread you, and from there he will take you. The Lord your God will bring you to the land that your fathers inherited, and you will inherit it, and you will prosper and multiply more than your forefathers. Very interesting here, by the way, that this is an exact mirror image of the curse. In the curse that I read to you before, at the end of 28, God talks about spreading you all over the nations where you will have no rest. Here, God says he's going to be gathering you from all those nations and bring you to the land. Now, one of the things I also found extremely interesting is this idea of the foot and one of the ways that God here in Deuteronomy talks in Deuteronomy 28 expresses the lack of comfort, rest, and settling of the nation when they're in exile, that they will always feel strangers, that they will never be at rest, is this idea of your foot, the palm of your foot, or however you would put that, will never find rest. To me, this echoes to me what God says to Joshua. Remember, God says to Joshua, every place that you put the sole of your foot, every place you place the sole of your foot, I will give you that land. This is exactly the opposite. The exile is a place where the sole of your foot will never come to rest, whereas in the land of Israel, it is the place where the sole of your foot will have rest, will mark the place that will be yours. So that's just a very interesting contrast worth paying attention to. Anyway, so if we go back to Deuteronomy 30, what we have here is the solution to the apparent contradiction between God's promise to give the land as an everlasting possession on the one hand, and yet the curses of the covenant on the other hand. God is saying, yes, I will exile you from your land because you will not be deserving of the land you have sinned. On the other hand, God said, it will never be a permanent situation. There will come a time where I will gather you again from all the nations to which you have been dispersed, and I will bring you back into the land, which you will then settle and prosper even more than your fathers. This then, in a nutshell, is Jewish history. Okay, we begin as a nation that is actually starting with a family, with our forefather Abraham, with a promise from God to Abraham. That promise is then fulfilled in the generation that has left Egypt, actually in their children, because the first generation that left Egypt perishes in the desert. The next generation is the fulfillment, witnesses or experiences the fulfillment of that promise as they enter the land under Joshua. They enter into this covenant with God at Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal in the land of Israel. And here they hear the promises. First of all, they hear their obligations to follow God, not to follow pagan gods. Their obligations to fulfill the commandments, to settle the land. And yet we hear also that there will be punishment if they breach that covenant. However, God ensures them that even if and when, and it's pretty clear here it's a when they breach that covenant and they're driven from the land, they will one day come back. Now, as the nation of Israel is standing there at Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal and hearing this, or entering into this covenant, and understanding two things at the same time, looking to one side and saying, whoa, there's the oak of Moreh. Everything that we are doing today is actually a fulfillment of God's word to Abraham hundreds of years ago. We learn from this, we experience from this, that God indeed keeps his promise. At the same time, we have a promise in Deuteronomy 30 that God has another promise. That even at some point, if the nation is in exile, they will one day be returned to the land. So they have this promise for the future, coupled with the experiencing of God's fulfillment of a past promise. And this dual concept is, in a way, seared into the Jewish DNA. So many people say, and it really is, it's one of the most amazing miracles. I would say like this: the establishment of the state of Israel is the greatest miracle of all time. And why? Because it's a miracle that took so long to happen. That all those years, we're talking now the second exile, the exile after the destruction of the second temple that took place in the 1st century. Almost 2,000 years passed until the nation of Israel came back and was restored in the land of Israel as an independent nation. This is absolutely unprecedented. No other nation on earth was dispersed from their land and lasted more than a couple of generations. And yet, not only have we come back to our land, which in and of itself is a miracle, but in order for us to have come into our land, we had to have remained a people for 2,000 years. I look at this time, this covenant ceremony at Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim as planting the seed that enabled that survival to happen. That we took into our DNA our confidence and our faith that God would indeed keep this promise, no matter how long it was going to take. We already had an example of 400 years from Abraham, and we said, okay, 400 years? Well, maybe it'll be even 2,000 years, but we have that promise and we believe it. And because we knew that one day God would restore us, we stayed as a people. Because we kept that promise with us. And this, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Bible that begins with Genesis 1 and goes all the way through to the ends of the Hebrew Scriptures, which for me is Chronicles, but you have a different order. So if you're Christian, the end of the Hebrew Scriptures for you is Malachi. But it's the same books in there. And this is a story of the Jewish people that we read and read and read again. And especially the 5 books of Moses, which we go through an annual cycle, reading them every single week in the synagogue. We know these verses by heart, and we have taken them into our hearts. And so we knew that one day this would happen. And that's what was that's how this whole Zionist revival began, because there were people who grew up on this idea of one day going back to Israel. And even though the original Zionist pioneers, so many of them had thrown off the religious faith and certainly some of the religious practice, or most of the religious practices, but they were Jewish. They were Jewish, and they were very much connected to their Jewish traditions. They had learned this and studied this and absorbed it. And so this tradition of the Jews coming back to the land of Israel was something that was part of them, whether they liked it or not. And they heard that voice within them, and they may have known it was from God, and they may have not have known it was from God, but it was from God, who brought them back to the land of Israel. And here we are in the land of Israel. And we have witnessing ourselves and experiencing the fulfillment of God's promise and his covenant to our people. Now, let me just remind you of one thing. Where is the Oak of Moreh? Where is Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim? This amazing area where this covenant, where the promise first took place with Abraham at the Oak of Moreh, and these mountains of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, where this amazing covenant took place when Joshua brought the nation into the land. Where are these places located? They are in the heart of Samaria. We talk all the time about Judea and Samaria as being the heart of biblical Israel. This place is in the heart of biblical Israel. And yet, this is the very same place where nations all over the world accuse Israel of illegally occupying a land that is not theirs. How can that be? We have come back to the very place where the initial promises to our nation took place from God, ensuring that this land would be ours. How can anybody say, how can anybody deny the right of the Jewish people to the entire land of Israel? But especially, how can anyone deny the right of the Jewish people to the very place where God first promised that land to the Jewish people, and where he executed the first covenant with the Jewish people upon their first entry into the land as a nation? Come and visit us. Join me in Samaria. I'd love to show you these places that we talked about today anytime. God bless you.